What happens when a former royal accustomed to deference and spotlight faces one of America's sharpest late-night provocators? What begins as polite conversation can unravel into raw confrontation. The kind of television that no amount of palace training or media coaching can control. Tonight, Prince Harry walked onto the Greg Gutfeld show expecting the usual applause and softball questions. What he got instead was something far different. A relentless host unwilling to play along with royal PR, and a clash that spiraled into one of the most unforgettable interviews in recent memory. The lights of the Gutfeld studio burned bright, bouncing off the glossy desk where Greg sat with his usual half-smile. The audience cheered politely as the announcer's voice boomed. "Please welcome Prince Harry." Harry strode onto the stage, shoulders squared, jaw set with the kind of confidence that some might call arrogance. He wore a fitted dark suit, trying to project casual charm. But his eyes carried a sharpness, the kind of look that suggested he wasn't here to be questioned, but to be admired. Greg stood to greet him, offering a handshake that Harry accepted with a brief squeeze. No smile. The prince lowered himself into the guest chair, crossing one leg over the other with a deliberate slowness that radiated entitlement. "Harry," Greg began warmly, "thanks for coming on. I know you've been busy. California life, media projects, new ventures. It's good to have you here." "Of course," Harry replied smoothly, his accent crisp but his tone clipped. "I suppose it's only fair I give your viewers a chance to hear directly from me rather than the nonsense they usually consume." The audience chuckled nervously. Greg's smirk flickered. He wasn't used to being dismissed this quickly into an interview. Still, he pressed on. "Well," Greg said, leaning back, "let's start light. How's married life treating you? Plenty of headlines about you and Meghan. People curious if California's been a good fit." Harry's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Married life is fine, Greg. More than fine, actually. But I do find it amusing that everyone feels entitled to ask about it, as if it's anyone's business but ours." The tone was sharp, dismissive. Greg raised his eyebrows, but kept his voice calm. "Fair enough, but you've lived a very public life. That curiosity comes with the territory, doesn't it?" Harry's eyes narrowed. "Territory I never asked for. But I suppose people like you have made quite a living dissecting things they don't understand." A murmur rippled through the audience. Greg chuckled lightly, masking the hit. "All right, let's pivot then. You've said often that moving to America gave you freedom. Do you feel the British public ever really understood you?" Harry leaned forward, his posture stiff. "Understood me? They were fed lies, Greg. Decades of a toxic press obsessed with clicks and gossip painting me as some reckless spare. That's not misunderstanding. That's deliberate character assassination." "Strong words," Greg said evenly. "But many in Britain would argue you turned your back on them, that you walked away from royal duty. How do you respond to that criticism?" Harry's laugh was short and cold. "Criticism from people who bow to an institution that trapped them in the first place. It's laughable. They cling to William and Kate like idols, blind to the rot in the system. At least I had the courage to leave." Gasps filled the audience. Greg's eyes flicked briefly toward the cameras. He knew this was gold. "Well," Greg said carefully, "since you brought up William and Kate, a lot of people admire them for embracing the responsibility you walked away from." "Do you?" Harry cut him off sharply. "Admire them, please. They've done nothing but play perfect for the cameras, nodding and smiling while hiding behind palace walls. You Americans worship them because you don't see the truth. And frankly, I'm tired of pretending they're saints." The words hit heavy, hanging in the air. Greg tapped his pen against his note cards, his trademark smirk fading into something sterner. "Interesting perspective," he said. "But many would say your life now isn't exactly free of cameras. Netflix, books, interviews. Some would argue you've monetized your exit pretty effectively. What would you say to them?" Harry leaned back, arms crossing, expression hard. "I'd say those people don't have the faintest clue what it's like to live under constant siege. I didn't monetize anything. I survived. And if people can't handle the fact that I tell my story, then perhaps they should stop obsessing over me and find a hobby." The audience gave a mixture of nervous laughs and uneasy silence. The tension was mounting fast, the studio air thick with anticipation. Greg gave a small nod, his voice still calm, though a spark had lit in his eyes. "All right, Harry, we'll get into all of that, but you should know I don't shy away from tough questions. And tonight, I think America wants some real answers." Harry's stare was unflinching, almost daring. "Then you'd better be ready for real answers, Greg. Not the fairy tales your viewers are used to." The stage was set. A polite interview had just veered off the rails. And the audience knew in that charged silence that what came next would not be polite at all. The applause sign blinked in the corner, but the audience's clapping was hesitant, awkward. They knew they weren't watching a friendly chat anymore. They were watching a duel. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes fixed on Harry like a chess player studying his opponent's next move. "Harry," Greg began slowly, "you've said leaving Britain was about freedom, about protecting your family, and yet since moving here, you've done Netflix specials, a multi-million-dollar book deal, podcasts, endless interviews." Some people wondered, did you leave duty behind or did you just swap one spotlight for another? Harry smirked, shaking his head as if the question were beneath him. "Greg, I left because I refused to be suffocated. You call it spotlight. I call it survival. And if I speak now, it's because my voice was taken from me for years. I've earned the right to tell my story." Greg raised a brow, still calm. "But isn't it fair to say you've told your story many times? Oprah, Netflix, Anderson Cooper, book tours. Some critics suggest you've built an entire brand around victimhood." Harry's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. Critics. Critics are people with nothing better to do than tear down those who are actually living life. My wife and I are not victims. We're survivors. And if people are tired of hearing my story, they can stop listening. It's really that simple. The audience shifted again. Murmurs filled the room. Greg smiled thinly, sensing the crowd's unease. "Let's talk about Meghan then. Your marriage is constantly in the headlines. Rumors, speculation, whispers of tension. How do you respond to people who say maybe California isn't the fairy tale you promised it would be?" Harry leaned forward, his tone dripping with irritation. "Greg, I'll make this simple. My marriage is none of your business. None of their business." He gestured vaguely at the audience. "We are happy. Happier than most couples you will find in this country. Frankly, it's insulting that I even have to answer to gossip." The words landed like a slap, the air in the studio tightening. Greg kept his voice even. "I only ask because you've been very public about your relationship. When you go on record about your struggles, when you write about private arguments in your book, when you and Meghan sit down with Oprah, you make your marriage part of the public conversation. Isn't it fair that people ask questions?" Harry's smirk returned, but now it carried venom. "Fair. Greg, the press has never played fair, and neither have people like you. You thrive on my personal life because without me, you'd have nothing to talk about. Admit it. My name keeps shows like this alive." The audience gasped audibly. Greg blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time, but he quickly recovered, leaning back and chuckling dryly. "You give yourself a lot of credit, Harry. I assure you this show would be just fine without you." Harry scoffed. "Would it? Or would you be back to cheap jokes and second-rate commentary? Let's be honest, Greg. This is the most relevant your program has been in years." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise. Even the cameraman shifted uncomfortably as Harry leaned back in his chair. Smug satisfaction written across his face. Greg inhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "All right, let's shift gears. You've spoken about the royal family, about being trapped, about feeling unsupported. Some might argue you abandoned not just the institution but your grandmother, your father, your brother. Do you regret the way you left things?" Harry's eyes flashed, his voice cutting. "Regret? The only regret I have is not leaving sooner. My grandmother loved me, but she was bound to the system. My father and brother chose duty over family. That's their prison, not mine. I escaped. And frankly, I don't envy them one bit." The audience's murmurs turned into shocked whispers. Greg sat up straighter now, his smirk gone, his voice sharpening. "You don't envy them because a lot of people see William and Kate as the model of stability, of dignity. Meanwhile, you've made headlines for trashing your family, for exposing private conversations, for turning centuries of tradition into your personal grievance tour." Harry snapped his head toward Greg, his tone icy. "William and Kate live in a cage. A gilded cage, yes, but a cage nonetheless. They smile, they wave, they pretend. And Americans eat it up. You call that dignity? I call it acting. At least I'm honest." Greg's pen tapped against his desk again, but this time it wasn't playful. It was sharp, deliberate. He leaned in, his voice steady, but with the bite. "Honest? You're calling this honesty? Cashing in on secrets, selling interviews, pointing fingers. That's not honesty, Harry. That's opportunism. And a lot of people, myself included, are starting to wonder if you've mistaken rebellion for relevance." Harry's eyes narrowed, his posture rigid. He didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't soften. His voice came out low and firm. You can call it whatever you like, Greg, but I know who I am, and I don't need the approval of the British public. The American public or late-night talk show hosts to validate my choices. I left a corrupt system behind, and if people can't handle that, it's their problem, not mine. The audience was silent now, waiting. The tension was unbearable, like a storm about to break. Greg exhaled, folded his arms across his chest, and gave a slow nod. All right, Harry, he said quietly, almost too calmly. We'll see just how honest you really are. The dual lines had been drawn. Harry sat like a king without a throne, daring the world to challenge him. Greg sat opposite, calm but seething, waiting for the moment to strike back. And everyone watching knew the storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Harry sat back with his arms folded, his face locked in the smug composure of someone who believed he had already won. Greg, however, leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his gaze fixed on Harry like a scalpel preparing to cut through armor. Harry, Greg began, his tone low but sharp, let me ask you this. If the monarchy was so oppressive, so suffocating, why do you keep talking about it? Why build a career around the very thing you claim to have escaped? Harry let out a humorless chuckle. Because it matters, Greg. It matters to expose hypocrisy, to show the world what really goes on behind palace walls. If my words make people uncomfortable, that's their issue. At least I'm not hiding. Greg tilted his head, smirk returning faintly. Not hiding? That's rich. You left Britain talking about privacy, but then signed a Netflix deal, released a tell-all memoir, and turned your life into content. That's not privacy, Harry. That's publicity with a price tag. The audience gave a collective, ooh, the sting of the words hanging in the air. Harry's expression tightened, his jaw clenching. You think you're clever, don't you? Harry shot back, his tone sharp. You sit there in your cheap suit, smirking, pretending to understand what it's like to live under global scrutiny. You have no idea. Greg didn't blink. Cheap suit? Harry, I bought this myself. You can't say the same about much of what you've worn in your life, can you? Let's be honest. Every privilege you've had, every opportunity, every stage came with the Windsor name. Without it, you're just another guy in LA with too much time on his hands. The studio gasped. Harry's ears reaned, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. That's absurd, Harry snapped. I've built something of my own. I've created a life outside of that family. Greg leaned back, his voice calm but cutting. No, Harry, you've monetized your family. Every dollar you've earned since leaving has come from your royal title, your royal drama, your royal grievances. Strip that away, and what's left? A man in California living in someone else's mansion, giving interviews about how unfair life has been. Harry's voice rose. That's a lie. Meghan and I have worked tirelessly to what? Greg interrupted smoothly. To produce content no one watches, to give interviews about struggles most people would kill to have. To play the role of outcast while living off the fortune and fame the very institution you despise gave you. Harry's face was flushed now, his hand tightening on the armrest of his chair. The polished calm he carried into the studio was gone. He leaned forward, pointing a finger toward Greg. You don't know me. You don't know the pain, the isolation, the betrayal I've faced. My wife and I, Greg, cut him off again, his tone sharper. Your wife, let's talk about her for a moment. She's an actress. She knew what the spotlight was. She thrived on it, and together you've turned your marriage into a performance, a brand. You think people can't see through it? The audience murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Harry's nostrils flared. Leave my wife out of this, Harry warned, his voice cold. Greg didn't flinch. What? She's half the act. You talk about protecting your family, yet you've built an empire on exposing them. You talk about oppression while living in luxury. You criticize William and Kate, but let's be honest. Isn't the real issue that you envy them? That they kept their duty, their dignity, while you chose self-pity. The words hit like daggers. Harry's face twisted, and for a split second, he looked less like a prince and more like a cornered man. He opened his mouth to retort, but his voice cracked slightly when he spoke. You don't understand anything, Harry spat. William and Kate are puppets. They perform. They're not free. I don't envy them. I pity them. Greg shook his head slowly, his tone steady. No, Harry, you envy them because they don't need to sell their story to be relevant. They don't need Netflix or Oprah or ghostwritten memoirs. They serve and people respect them. You left and people rolled their eyes. That's the difference. The audience erupted in gasps, whispers, a few nervous claps. Harry's composure shattered further, his voice rising with fury. "You arrogant little man. You think you can sit there and lecture me about my life? You've never lived a day in my shoes. You're nothing but a commentator, a clown making cheap jokes for an American audience." Greg leaned forward, his smile sharp and deliberate. "And yet here you are on my show. Because without us, without the press, without the critics, without out of the family you spend your life criticizing. But you're nothing but a title with throne." The silence that followed was deafening. Harry's chest rose and fell heavily, his face crimson, his fists clenched. The prince who once carried himself with untouchable grace now looked rattled, exposed, cornered. Greg sat back in his chair, his calm restored. "So tell me, Harry," he said, voice quiet but laced with steel. "Who are you without them? Who are you without the crown, the scandal, the spotlight?" Harry didn't answer. He couldn't. The audience sat frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in the studio stretched long, heavy, and uncomfortable. Prince Harry sat stiff in his chair, his jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling with visible anger. Greg leaned back, fingers drumming on the desk, waiting. The audience barely moved, every pair of eyes locked on the former royal, whose arrogance had carried him straight into a trap. Finally, Greg broke the silence. His voice was calm, but each word landed like a hammer. "You know, Harry, there's something fascinating about you. You left one of the most powerful families in the world, claiming you wanted privacy, peace, a normal life. And yet, here you are sitting on television again, telling the same story, demanding sympathy. Do you see the contradiction?" Harry scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "That's your narrative of Greg. You twist everything. I didn't demand sympathy. I demanded respect. Something you wouldn't understand." Greg's smirk returned sharper than before. "Respect is earned, Harry, and let me be honest, you haven't earned much. You talk about escaping the monarchy, but you've built your entire identity around it. Strip away the royal drama, the titles, the grievances. What's left? Who are you?" Harry's cheeks flushed red. He leaned forward, pointing directly at Greg. "Who am I? I'm someone who walked away from an oppressive system. I'm someone who refused to be a pawn in my brother's shadow. I'm someone who." Greg cut him off, his voice rising for the first time all night. "You're someone who abandoned your duty. You're someone who cashed in on your family name while tearing it down. You're someone who spends every waking moment reminding the world that you're miserable from the comfort of a mansion most people couldn't dream of affording." The audience gasped audibly. Harry froze, his hands still raised, his face tightening into a mask of fury. Greg pressed on, no longer pulling punches. "You talk about William and Kate like they're trapped. No, Harry, they're respected because they stayed. They serve. They honor the role they were born into. And deep down, you hate it. You envy it because while they stand tall, you're here so begging for relevance, trading secrets for checks, pretending to be the rebel when really you're just lost." Harry shot up from his chair, the scrape of it against the floor echoing through the stunned studio. His face was crimson, his voice shaking with rage. "How dare you? You don't know me. You don't know my family. You don't know the hell I've been through. You sit here mocking, sneering, safe in your little chair while I've lived with threats, lies, betrayal." Greg stood too, meeting Harry eye to eye, his voice hard as steel. "And yet somehow William and Kate survived the same family, the same press, the same palace without burning it all down. The difference, Harry, is that they grew up. You didn't. You're not a survivor. You're not a leader. You're not even a royal anymore. You're just a man living off the fumes of a title. You no longer deserve." The words landed like gunfire. The audience erupted. Gasps scattered applause. Nervous murmurs. Harry's eyes widened, and for a flicker of a second hurt cut through the fury. His lips trembled and his voice cracked when he shouted back. "You think you can humiliate me on your show? You think you can define who I am? I don't have to sit here and take this." He yanked off his microphone, tossing it onto the chair with a sharp thud. "This is beneath me. You're beneath me. I won't be part of this circus another second." And with that, Harry stormed off the set, his footsteps heavy, his back rigid. The cameras followed him for a moment until he disappeared behind the stage curtains. For a few heartbeats, the studio sat in stunned silence. Then all eyes turned to Greg. The host smoothed his jacket, his smirk returning with calm satisfaction. He sat back down, picked up his pen, and looked straight into the camera. "Well," Greg said wryly, "there you have it. A man who wanted privacy, storming off live television. A man who talks about honesty, refusing to answer real questions. A man who left the monarchy, but can't seem to leave it behind. The audience broke into applause, some cheering, others still buzzing with shock. Greg leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of a closing statement. Here's the truth. Titles don't make character. Palaces don't make integrity. And running away doesn't make you free. It just makes you lost. Prince Harry walked onto this stage expecting difference. What he got was accountability, and clearly he couldn't handle it. The camera zoomed in on Greg as he delivered the final blow. Ladies and gentlemen, that was one of the most extraordinary interviews we've ever had. We'll be right back. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and the audience erupted once more. On social media, clips would spread like wildfire within minutes. Headlines would scream about the prince's meltdown, and Greg Gutfeld would sit at his desk, calm and composed, having just dismantled one of the most controversial figures of modern royalty. What do you think really triggered Harry's meltdown? Was Greg too harsh, or did Harry finally face the accountability he's been avoiding? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more explosive interviews, dramatic clashes, and behind-the-scenes confrontations, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next.